A democratic 1940s Germany. Modern Germany is one of the most stable democracies, peaceful, prosperous, and at the heart of the European Union. But less than a century ago, it stood on the brink of collapse. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor, setting off a chain of events that would plunge the world into war and genocide. But that rise to power wasn't inevitable. Germany in the early 1930s was in crisis. The Great Depression had devastated its economy. Inflation, unemployment, and political instability had paralyzed the Weimar Republic. Extremist parties gained ground, and the Nazi Party surged in popularity. Still, Hitler never won a majority outright. His appointment came only after backroom deals between conservative elites who believed they could control him. They were wrong. But if they'd made a different choice, formed another coalition, kept Hitler out of government, or if a certain art school in Vienna had just said yes, history might have taken a radically different turn. In this alternate timeline, the Weimar Republic might have limped forward as a fragile democracy, or perhaps another authoritarian leader would have taken power, one without the same racial ideology or global ambitions. Either way, the Nazi regime would never rise. No swastikas, no SS, no final solution. Without Hitler, World War II as we know it likely doesn't even happen. Germany may still clash with neighbors over borders or pride, but there's no invasion of Poland in 1939, no blitzkrieg across Europe, and no Holocaust. Tens of millions of lives, Jews, Poles, Soviets, civilians, and soldiers alike, would be spared. And in the present day, Germany would still likely be a major European power, but one shaped by continuity rather than catastrophe. Its economy might have grown steadily rather than being rebuilt from ruins. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Berlin would retain their original architecture instead of post-war concrete and reconstruction. The population wouldn't carry the legacy of collective guilt, and global perceptions of Germany would be rooted in innovation, not rehabilitation. The absence of the Nazi era means no Holocaust education shaping global ethics, no Nuremberg trials to define international law, and no never again mantras at the heart of post-war diplomacy. The global human rights movement might take longer to emerge or take a different form entirely. The arts, literature, and cinema that responded to Nazi Germany and its genocide might never be created. The balance of power in Europe might be more evenly distributed. A stable, democratic Germany could have anchored the continent earlier, reducing the need for NATO in its current form. The Cold War, without a divided Germany, might have played out more gradually or never escalated into a global standoff at all. And the name Hitler? Likely forgotten, just another failed politician lost in the paperwork of the early 1930s. A democratic 19th century Russia. Modern Russia is known for its strongman politics and a complicated, often hostile relationship with democracy. But rewind to the year 1825 and a very different version of Russia almost emerged. One that could have transformed the empire into a constitutional monarchy decades before Europe's own wave of democratic reforms. It started with the Decembrist Revolt. After the sudden death of Tsar Alexander I, the Russian throne was supposed to pass to his brother, Constantine. But Constantine had secretly renounced his claim, so the crown went to the next in line, Nicholas I. The succession was messy and confusing, creating a rare power vacuum at the top of an autocratic empire. That's when a group of army officers, many of them aristocrats, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, and deeply influenced by Enlightenment ideas, refused to swear loyalty to Nicholas. Instead, they gathered troops in St. Petersburg and demanded a constitution, civil liberties, and limits on the monarchy. In short, Western-style reform in the heart of Imperial Russia. It was bold, it was radical, and it was over within a day. The Decembrists were poorly organized, and most regiments stayed loyal to the Tsar. The revolt was crushed. The leaders were executed or exiled to Siberia. Nicholas I took the throne and responded with a brutal crackdown. What followed was one of the most repressive eras in Russian history, marked by censorship, secret police, and political paralysis. But what if the Decembrists had succeeded? Even a limited victory, a forced constitution, a weak parliament, or formal civil rights would have fundamentally altered the empire's political DNA. Russia might have modernized its governance early, the way Britain, Belgium, and even Prussia eventually did. The seeds of representative government could have taken root long before the 20th century's revolutions ever reached Russian soil. Industrialization could have started earlier and more evenly. Serfdom might have been abolished with a clear legal framework, avoiding the chaotic land reforms of later Tsars. And without the crushing weight of autocracy, the social and economic pressure that eventually led to the Bolshevik Revolution might never have built up. No Lenin, no Soviet Union, no Cold War. And without that global standoff, the alliances that shaped the 20th century might never have formed. No NATO, no Warsaw Pact, just a different kind of geopolitical map. Russia, instead of standing apart from the West, might have developed alongside it. More trade, fewer tanks, fewer iron curtains, more open doors. Imagine a Russia that evolved more like a giant version of modern Germany or the UK, a constitutional monarchy with a functioning parliament, regulated capitalism, and a real middle class. Instead of secret police and poison tea, you'd have political parties, watchdog journalism, and peaceful transfers of power. The ruble would probably be stronger, and so would civil society, and the idea of Russia as a global disruptor might never have taken hold. It still would have been cold, just, with better governance. A united Indian subcontinent. Modern South Asia is shaped by a line drawn in 1947, a rushed, violent partition that split British India into two nations, India and Pakistan. It triggered one of the largest mass migrations in human history, uprooting over 15 million people and unleashing a wave of communal violence that killed up to 2 million. The trauma of that moment still echoes in the politics and identities of both countries. But what if the line had never been drawn? In 1946, the British proposed the Cabinet Mission Plan, a last-ditch effort to preserve Indian unity. The plan offered a federal structure, a weak central government handling defense, foreign policy, and communications, while provinces, especially Muslim-majority ones, would retain autonomy. The goal was to satisfy both of India's main political camps. On one side, the Indian National Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, a secular modernist who wanted a unified, centralized state. On the other, the All India Muslim League, led by Muhammad al-Jinnah, who had grown disillusioned with Congress and feared permanent marginalization for Muslims in a Hindu-majority India. Jinnah now called for a separate Muslim homeland, Pakistan. For a brief moment, both parties agreed to the framework, but when Nehru later signaled that Congress would not be bound by the decentralized structure, trust collapsed. Jinnah walked away. Partition became inevitable. Independence came, but so did chaos. But let's quickly imagine that compromise held. A united India, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Jains, Buddhists, Parsis, would have still entered independence as one nation, not two. Muslims wouldn't be a vulnerable minority. They'd make up about a third of the population with significant influence in government, policy, and culture. Politics would be forced to function through coalition, negotiation, and pluralism, not polarization. Don't get us wrong, there would still be tension. Communal divides don't vanish overnight, but instead of becoming entrenched across national borders, those tensions would be mediated through shared institutions, legislatures, courts, elections. The India-Pakistan rivalry would be replaced by fiery regional politics, not existential military standoffs. Cities like Lahore, Delhi, and Hyderabad might have remained multicultural hubs, not divided by barbed wire or ideology. Urdu could still be a national language. Sikh and Muslim heritage sites would be celebrated as part of a common cultural story. And the unimaginable human toll of partition, families torn apart, villages burned, trains full of corpses, might never have happened. Now zoom out. This united South Asia would be a superstate. With over 1.6 billion people, it would be the most populous country on Earth. Its combined GDP would exceed 4.5 trillion, placing it in the top 3 global economies. It would hold incredible industrial and agricultural strength, from Mumbai to Karachi, from Bangalore to Lahore. Its military would be the largest standing army in the world with over 2 million active duty troops, and instead of two nuclear-armed rivals facing off, you'd have one with centralized command and far fewer risks of escalation. But most importantly, this country would be held together not by force but by necessity. Religious and cultural pluralism wouldn't just be tolerated, it would be embedded in the system. Messy? Sure, but resilient. And yes, cricket would still be sacred, but instead of India versus Pakistan as a high-stakes grudge match, it'd be a fierce domestic rivalry, like Mumbai versus Karachi in a unified national league. Same passion, one flag, and no partition. The United Kingdom plus France. France today is unmistakably French, secular, republican, and fiercely proud of its cultural identity. Its language, cuisine, and worldview have shaped the modern world. But for much of the Middle Ages, France's future was far less certain. In fact, with a few different outcomes on the battlefield, the country could have ended up speaking English, or at least been ruled by it. The 100 Years' War of 1337 to 1453 wasn't a single war, but a series of dynastic conflicts between the royal houses of England and France. It began when Edward III of England claimed the French crown through his mother's lineage. Over the next century, the war would see dramatic swings in fortune, devastating both kingdoms. At its peak, English power in France looked unstoppable. Henry V's victory at Agincourt in 1415 decimated the French nobility. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes named Henry as heir to the French throne, disinheriting the Valois line. The English occupied much of northern France, including Paris, and seemed poised to merge the two crowns under a dual monarchy. But that vision collapsed faster than expected. In 1429, a teenage peasant, Joan of Arc, rallied French forces at the siege of Orléans and began a turnaround for the Valois. Over the next 2 decades, French armies pushed back English forces province by province. By 1543, the English had lost everything except the port of Calais. The dream of an English-ruled France was over. Still, had a few events gone differently, if Orléans had fallen or if the English had maintained unity and local support, the political landscape could have shifted dramatically. A lasting English presence in France wouldn't have meant the country became British, but it could have altered the pace and shape of French identity. Northern France, especially areas long under English control like Normandy and Gascony, might have developed into semi-autonomous regions under English administration. Local elites might have pledged loyalty to an English crown in Paris or Rouen rather than resisting it. The French language, already sharing space with Anglo-Norman in elite circles, could have retreated from legal and political life in certain regions, much as Gaelic did in Scotland. A centralized, Paris-led French nationalism might have taken centuries longer to emerge. Culturally, France would remain distinct. Catholicism would still dominate, and regional dialects would continue to thrive. But the ideological foundations of modern France, the Republic, the Revolution, the secular state, might never have crystallized. Without the French Revolution, ideas like liberté, égalité, fraternité might have stayed in the realm of philosophy, not policy. Anglo-French cooperation might have replaced centuries of rivalry, and the Enlightenment could have arrived in English. And in today's world, France might still boast wine, art, and existentialism, but with less protest and more pageantry. The food would remain excellent, of course, but yes, your waiter might offer you the menu in English. A 1940 Anglo-German Truce. Britain today is remembered for its defiance in 1940, a nation standing alone as Nazi Germany rolled across Europe. Churchill's speeches, the RAF holding the skies, the Blitz, Dunkirk, all part of a national mythology built around resistance. But in the summer of that year, defiance wasn't guaranteed. For a brief moment, Britain considered peace. France had fallen, the Low Countries were under German control, the United States remained neutral, and in Britain's war cabinet, the debate was real: fight on or negotiate. At the center of this question was Lord Halifax, Foreign Secretary and influential Conservative statesman. Halifax believed that with Germany dominating the continent, the rational course was to explore a settlement, perhaps brokered through Mussolini's Italy. The goal? Preserve British sovereignty, avoid invasion, and maintain the empire without further bloodshed. Opposing him was Winston Churchill, only weeks into his premiership. Churchill saw negotiation as moral collapse. He believed any deal with Hitler would be temporary at best, disastrous at worst, leaving Britain exposed and humiliated. His position was clear: we shall never surrender. The cabinet was split. Halifax had support. Churchill had passion, and soon, the people. After days of intense debate, Halifax stepped back. Churchill's resolve carried the day. Britain would fight. But it was close, very close, and it wasn't purely ideological. Halifax's position wasn't cowardice, it was strategic. Britain's military was depleted. The army had just evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind most of its equipment. The Luftwaffe loomed. Many feared invasion was imminent. From that vantage point, a negotiated peace seemed like a reasonable insurance policy. Had Halifax's approach won out, Britain might have explored terms with Germany, not as allies, but as neutrals. Hitler, eager to secure his Western Front before turning east toward the Soviet Union, may have offered seemingly generous terms. Britain keeps its monarchy, its colonies, even nominal independence. In return, it steps out of the war. It's unclear how far such talks could have gone. Hitler admired the British Empire in an abstract sense, but trust would have been minimal, and any deal would have been a gamble on Hitler's restraint, on Britain's future relevance, and on the moral cost of neutrality in the face of fascism. Churchill's gamble was different. He bet that Britain could hold out alone long enough for the war to widen and for American power to eventually join the fight. He was right, but at the time it wasn't obvious. Had the war cabinet tipped the other way, Britain might have avoided the Blitz, but also missed the moment that defined its 20th century identity. It wouldn't have lost the war, but it might have lost the story it now tells about itself. In the end, Churchill's decision wasn't just about strategy, it was about legacy, and history, as it turns out, rewarded the risk. A unified Cold War Korea. Today, the Korean Peninsula is a symbol of division. 2 states, 2 systems, and one of the most militarized borders in the world. In the south, democracy, global tech giants, and K-pop. In the north, isolation, authoritarian rule, and nuclear threats. But in the early 1950s, it could have ended very differently. Because for 3 years during the Korean War, the future of the peninsula was completely up for grabs. In 1950, North Korea invaded the south, aiming to unify the peninsula under communist rule. But the war quickly escalated. UN forces, led by the United States, pushed deep into North Korean territory. Pyongyang fell. For a brief window, it looked like Seoul might reunify Korea, this time under a democratic pro-Western government. Then China intervened. Hundreds of thousands of troops crossed the Yalu River, pushing UN and South Korean forces back. The front was eventually stabilized, and by 1953 an armistice was signed. The split remained. But if China hadn't intervened, or had come too late, South Korea might have captured the entire north. The peninsula would be one country today, and that country would look very different. A unified Korea under Southern leadership would be one of Asia's most powerful nations. South Korea's economic miracle, built on industrialization, exports, and innovation, could have extended across the peninsula. Cities like Pyongyang, Hamhung, and Chongjin might be tech and manufacturing hubs, not ghost cities cut off from the rest of the world. The North's natural resources, especially rare earth metals and minerals, would fuel Korean industry. Infrastructure development would have happened decades earlier. The cultural and economic divide? Gone before it began. There'd be no need for summits, no DMZ, no nuclear threat, just one Korea, building one future. Politically, the country would likely be a robust democracy shaped by decades of open elections and global integration. Culturally, there'd be no parallel systems, just a single Korean identity rooted in freedom, shared history, and rapid modernization. With over 75 million people and a unified economy, Korea could rival Japan and Germany in global influence. In the Pacific, it would be a major democratic counterbalance to China, anchored in Seoul but tied deeply to the global system. But history didn't bend that way, and it could have gone the other way as well. If UN forces hadn't held the line, if Seoul had fallen a second time, if American reinforcements hadn't arrived when they did, the peninsula might have been unified not by Seoul, but by Pyongyang. A North Korean victory would have meant a communist Korea stretching from the Yalu River to the southern coast under the rule of Kim Il-sung. No DMZ, no armistice, just one Korea, red from coast to coast, backed by Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China. And today, that Korea would likely resemble a bigger, more powerful version of North Korea as it exists now. A centralized, militarized state. The Kim family in every textbook. Their portraits in every home. One-party rule from top to bottom. Seoul wouldn't be a tech capital, it would be a tightly controlled provincial city. Ports like Busan and Incheon would serve the state economy, not global markets. There'd be roads and factories, sure, but built with Chinese aid. There'd be no K-pop, no Korean cinema boom, no soft power exports. South Korea's economic miracle never happens. The entire peninsula's GDP would lag far behind its neighbors. Innovation would be limited to state-approved sectors, mostly heavy industry, agriculture, and defense. Globally, a communist Korea would tilt the regional balance hard. Japan's posture would harden. Taiwan would become more isolated. US influence across East Asia might weaken significantly. No major ally on the mainland. No buffer state against China. Culturally, there would be only one narrative, the states. Art, music, religion, tightly censored and shaped for ideological unity. Generations of Koreans would grow up under surveillance and indoctrination. And yet, within the global anti-colonial movement, this Korea might be hailed as a revolutionary success story. A country that expelled foreign occupiers and defied the West. It might hold seats of honor at non-aligned summits, trade with China, and build underground ties with other authoritarian regimes. No border, no summits, just a unified authoritarian Korea, nuclear-armed, domestically unchallenged, and ruled by one dynasty. A surviving South Vietnamese state. Modern Vietnam is a unified socialist republic, one of Southeast Asia's fastest growing economies with deep historical scars and a single-party government that still carries the legacy of war and reunification. But for nearly 2 decades, Vietnam wasn't one nation, it was two, and for a time, it seemed entirely possible that it would stay that way. The Vietnam War, known within the country as the American War, was one of the defining conflicts of the Cold War. North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, sought to unify the country under communism. South Vietnam, supported by the United States and its allies, fought to preserve its independence. After years of brutal fighting and devastating losses on all sides, Saigon fell in 1975. The war ended, Vietnam was reunified under the North's rule, and the red flag rose across the entire country. But it didn't have to end that way. A more sustainable US strategy, stronger South Vietnamese leadership, a better executed withdrawal after the 1973 Paris Peace Accords. If South Korea had been able to stabilize, the country might have remained permanently divided, much like Korea. And today, South Vietnam could still exist, a capitalist democratic republic, perhaps headquartered in Saigon, with multi-party elections, American and Japanese investment, and a modern export-driven economy. Its growth trajectory might have echoed South Korea or Taiwan. Rapid industrialization, strong development, and a globally competitive middle class. North Vietnam, in contrast, would have likely remained more closed off, an ideological ally of Beijing or Moscow, slower to liberalize, more reliant on centralized planning and political orthodoxy. The 17th parallel would have hardened into a permanent border. Military build-ups, propaganda wars, and occasional border skirmishes would be ongoing realities. A divided Vietnam would reshape Southeast Asia. The US military presence in the region might have continued for decades, serving as a counterbalance to both China and Soviet influence. Cambodia and Laos might have faced different outcomes or aligned differently in response to two competing Vietnams. ASEAN, as a regional bloc, would likely place more focus on security and ideological balancing. Culturally, Vietnam's global diaspora would have split more cleanly. Many refugee communities in the West would maintain direct ties to an existing, functioning South Vietnamese state. The ideological rifts would not be a generational memory, it would be a living political reality. And Saigon, still called Saigon, would be a very different city. Not a symbol of chaos and retreat, but a capital that stood its ground. A city of skyscrapers and trade, not just memory. The flag would be different, the textbooks would be different, the politics would be open and not one party. And ultimately, the war's ending wouldn't be a collapse, but a compromise. In that world, Vietnam wouldn't be unified, but it would be two nations, two systems, and two very different futures. A Dutch Brazil, the colony that almost was. Brazil today is the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world, shaped by centuries of Lusophone influence in everything from language and law to religion and national identity. But in the 17th century, that Portuguese dominance came under serious challenge. For over 2 decades, a different European flag flew over a large stretch of Brazil's northeastern coast. And with a bit more support, it might never have come down. In the early 1600s, the Dutch West India Company launched an aggressive push into South America as part of a wider struggle against Spanish and Portuguese imperial dominance. By 1630, the Dutch had captured a significant portion of Brazil's northeastern region, centered around Pernambuco, including the important port Recife. For a time, the experiment worked. Under the leadership of Count John Maurice of Nassau, Dutch Brazil saw a period of notable urban planning, scientific inquiry, and a level of religious tolerance that contrasted sharply with the rigid Catholic orthodoxy of the Portuguese colonies. The Dutch brought a mercantile and pragmatic colonial model focused on trade, infrastructure, and profit over religious conversion or centralized royal control. They also allowed Jews, Protestants, and Catholics to coexist to a degree uncommon in colonial Latin America. Recife even became home to the first synagogue in the Americas. While Dutch rule wasn't universally welcomed, it relied on enslaved labor and faced resistance from Portuguese settlers, it offered a different vision of colonialism. But holding overseas territory is expensive. The Dutch Republic, heavily engaged in European conflict and dependent on commercial returns, struggled to maintain its grip. After a series of uprisings and prolonged guerrilla resistance by Portuguese colonists, backed increasingly by reinforcements from Lisbon, Dutch forces were expelled in 1654. Portuguese control resumed, and Brazil continued on a unified Lusophone path. But had the Dutch reinforced their position, militarily or financially, or secured stronger local alliances, Dutch Brazil could have endured. If so, today's map of South America might look very different. The northeastern region, anchored around Recife and extending toward Natal and beyond, could have developed into a distinct Dutch-influenced entity. Linguistically, it might have remained Dutch-speaking or evolved into a bilingual zone, much like Suriname or parts of the Caribbean. You might find Dutch place names, Protestant churches, and civil law shaped by Dutch legal traditions. Afro-Brazilian traditions would still flourish, but layered with Dutch architectural styles, Protestant values, and more decentralized political institutions. A legacy of pluralism might remain, making the region more federalist, diverse, and economically tied to Atlantic trade routes. Brazil might not be a single, unified republic. The existence of a long-term Dutch colony could have resulted in a looser federation, or even two separate nations. A cultural divide between the Portuguese-speaking south and the Dutch-influenced north might mirror something like Belgium's Flemish Walloon split. Carnival? Still loud, still colourful, just with more canals, stroopwafels, and a few tulips mixed in. And hey, maybe in this timeline, the Dutch win the World Cup. An independent Quebec. Canada today is a bilingual federation, spanning oceans, provinces, and politics with a quiet, careful balance between French and English identities. Quebec, its cultural heartbeat, is proudly distinct, but firmly part of the whole. Parliament debates in both official languages. The fleur-de-lis flies beside the maple leaf. But all of that nearly changed in 1995 by the narrowest of margins. That year, Quebec held its second referendum on sovereignty. The question was direct: should Quebec begin the process of becoming independent? After months of emotional debate, high-stakes campaigns, and voter turnout nearing 94%, the no side prevailed. Barely. Just 50.6% rejected secession. A shift of a few thousand votes would have triggered a breakup of the Canadian Federation. For a brief moment, the country's future hung by a thread. Had yes edged ahead, Quebec would have entered negotiations to separate, peacefully, legally, and very likely permanently. Imagine a sovereign Quebec today, French-speaking, secular, and proudly Republican. Montreal is the capital, French the only official language, a new passport, a new currency, and a seat at the United Nations. Its political culture might lean European, social democratic, culturally assertive, and fiercely protective of language laws. Internationally, it could align more closely with France or the Francophone world, building its own diplomatic identity apart from Ottawa. Canada, now without Quebec, would be a different country. More Anglophone, more Western in its political weight, and more introspective about its national identity. The delicate bilingual balance would be gone. Federal politics would shift dramatically, with Ontario gaining dominance and provinces like Alberta and British Columbia asserting new roles. Without Quebec, the very idea of Canadian multiculturalism might have evolved in a different, less linguistically complex direction. Trade would adapt, but logistics would get trickier. Cross-border travel between Ottawa and Montreal would now involve customs checkpoints. Inter-provincial agreements would become international ones. Defense, telecoms, airspace. Every shared system would need a second draft. And culturally, Quebec's already rich arts, cinema, and literature would evolve even further, no longer balancing between two national identities, but defining one of its own. The language would sound the same, the streets would look familiar, but the politics, the passport, and the perspective entirely different. It would still be Quebec, just no longer Canadian. A French Australia. Australia today is English-speaking, democratic, and proudly laid back. Its legal system is British, its head of state lives in London, and its major alliances are firmly rooted in the Anglosphere. From cricket to common law, the country reflects the empire that colonized it. But none of this was guaranteed. If one ship had docked a little sooner, Australia might be speaking French today. In 1788, the British First Fleet landed in Botany Bay to establish a penal colony. Just days later, a French expedition led by Jean-François de la Pérouse arrived at the same spot. The timing was uncanny. La Pérouse didn't stay long. He left, vanished, and was never heard from again, but his arrival was part of a broader French interest in the Pacific. Explorers like Nicolas Baudin had been charting the Australian coastline around the same time as Britain's Matthew Flinders. The two even crossed paths. For a brief moment, it wasn't obvious who would claim the continent. Had the French established a foothold, even in the west or south, the country's future could have looked very different. Imagine a French-speaking Australia, more Quebec than Queensland, French civil law instead of British common law, Catholicism as the dominant religion, dual-language government, or maybe just one, and it's not English. Place names like Nouvelle Marseille, Port Napoleon, and Terre Australe instead of Melbourne or Sydney. The flag? Probably red, white, and blue, but arranged very differently. In today's world, that alternate Australia would feel like a different country entirely. Its foreign policy might lean toward France and continental Europe instead of Britain and the US. It could be a member of La Francophonie, not the Commonwealth. Its immigration patterns would likely bring in more French-speaking populations from Africa or the Caribbean, not post-war waves from Britain and Ireland. Even its political system might mirror France's hybrid model, more centralized, more secular, and a little more volatile. It'd still be Australia at its core, but with French undertones. Less beer, more wine. More strikes, fewer barbecues. Rugby would still be a thing, but with a bit more flair and a lot more complaining about referees. And no matter what language you speak, the Emu War would probably still be a thing. A Mexican victory in the Mexican-American War. Modern Mexico shares a 3,100-kilometer border with the United States, one that defines much of the region's politics, migration, and trade. But that line wasn't always there. In the early 19th century, vast territories now considered quintessentially American, California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming were Mexican. By 1848, that had all changed. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 was sparked by disputes over Texas, which Mexico still claimed even after its US-backed independence. But the war was also driven by Washington's broader ambitions under Manifest Destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand from coast to coast. The result was a decisive American victory, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the loss of over half of Mexico's national territory. But that outcome wasn't inevitable. Mexico, though politically divided and underfunded, wasn't inherently doomed to lose. With better leadership, internal unity, or more time to prepare, the Mexican army could have mounted a stronger defense. A prolonged war may have drawn the attention of European powers, especially France or Britain, who had interests in containing US expansion. Even a military stalemate could have forced a more balanced peace agreement. And today, that alternate Mexico would be a very different country. Instead of stopping at the Rio Grande, Mexico could stretch from the Yucatan to the Pacific Northwest. The modern cities of Los Angeles, San Francisco, Austin, Phoenix, and Denver would be Mexican. California's gold rush, Texas's oil boom, and the Southwest's real estate and tech industries would have fueled Mexican industrialization, not American. Mexico could be among the top global economies with vast natural resources, deep water ports on both oceans, and a population potentially exceeding 180 million. With wealth concentrated in both the industrial north and the historical heartlands of central Mexico, the country would likely operate as a highly federalized system, balancing regional autonomy with central governance. The Southwest wouldn't be a zone of Mexican influence, it would be Mexican. Spanish place names wouldn't sit alongside American highways, they would define national infrastructure. The cultural fusion seen in states like New Mexico or California would run much deeper. Latin America's largest economy would also be one of its most culturally influential. For the United States, the consequences would be equally profound. Its access to the Pacific would be delayed, possibly preventing the gold rush from transforming the US economy. The balance between free and slave states that led to the Civil War might have shifted, delaying or accelerating internal conflict. US expansion would have been smaller, slower, and more contested. And the modern border debate? That wall, if anyone still wanted one, would be a lot farther north, possibly near Kansas. And yes, the warning signs might be written in Spanish. A Portuguese South Africa. Modern South Africa is shaped by layers of European colonization, first Dutch, then British, leaving behind a complex legacy of language, culture, and law. Afrikaans, Anglican churches, cricket fields, and common law courts all trace back to that colonial past. But centuries earlier, it could have gone very differently. Because the first Europeans to reach the Cape weren't Dutch or British, they were Portuguese. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans connected. Less than a decade later, Vasco da Gama passed the Cape on his way to India, completing the first all-sea routes from Europe to Asia. Portugal had mapped and named the southern tip of Africa before almost anyone else. They even named it the Cape of Storms, later renamed by King John II to something more optimistic. But rather than settle it, the Portuguese moved on. Their focus was further east, on Mozambique, India, Malacca, and eventually Brazil. The Cape, while strategically important, was seen mainly as a refueling stop. For nearly 150 years, it remained just that, a place for passing ships to take on fresh water and repair sails. It wasn't until 1652 that the Dutch East India Company established a permanent supply station, laying the groundwork for centuries of Dutch and later British control. But had the Portuguese made a different decision, establishing a fort, mission, or port at the Cape in the early 1500s, the trajectory of southern Africa might have shifted. A Portuguese South Africa would mean Portuguese as the dominant language from Cape Town to the Karoo. Early settlements would have likely followed the Lusophone model: Catholic missions, fortified trading posts, and plantation economies tied to the Atlantic world. Coastal towns would be dotted with colonial churches, Baroque architecture, and Portuguese place names. Relations with indigenous groups like the Khoikhoi might have been shaped more by religious assimilation and intermarriage. The slave trade would likely have linked South Africa more closely to Angola and Brazil, deepening its integration in the Lusophone Atlantic economy. In today's world, this South Africa would feel less like a British Commonwealth nation and more like a southern extension of Portuguese Africa. Its political institutions might mirror post-colonial Mozambique or Angola, Catholic-influenced, Lusophone, and shaped by different liberation struggles. Afrikaans probably wouldn't exist, as the initial border trekkers could have been dissuaded by Portugal's presence in the region. English might still be present, but it wouldn't carry the same institutional weight. The regional balance of power in southern Africa would also look different. British expansion from the Cape might never have happened or would have collided with Portuguese interests far earlier, reshaping borders across the subcontinent. And instead of the Springboks, maybe the Seleção, kitted in green and gold, singing the national anthem in Portuguese. Constantinople survives. Today, Istanbul stands as one of the world's great crossroads, bridging Europe and Asia, Islam and the West, Empire and Republic. Its skyline blends minarets and domes, its streets echo with centuries of Ottoman history, but until 1453, it was Constantinople, the last outpost of the Byzantine Empire and the final breath of Rome in the east. Its fall reshaped empires, trade, and faith, but the siege could have failed. By the mid-15th century, Constantinople was a shell of its imperial past, surrounded by Ottoman territory, its population reduced to tens of thousands, its defenses aging. Still, its Theodosian walls had withstood invasions for a millennium. Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, brought overwhelming firepower to the siege, including massive cannons built by Hungarian engineer Orban, designed to break what had once seemed unbreakable. After weeks of bombardment, multiple breaches, and only limited Western aid, the city finally fell. On May 29, 1453, the Ottomans entered Constantinople. It became the empire's new capital, and the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist. The fall was both symbolic and strategic. The ancient Christian city became a cornerstone of Muslim rule, a capital of the Islamic world, and a turning point in European history. Several Western powers, Venice, Genoa, and the papacy, debated intervention. A few Genoese ships did arrive, but far too late and far too few. Internal disputes in Italy, rivals among Catholic states, and lingering suspicion of Byzantium after the 1054 East-West Schism all weakened the Christian response. Still, a stronger alliance, a failed Ottoman cannon barrage, or even a plague in the Ottoman camp could have tipped the balance. Had Constantinople held, had the siege been lifted, the map of southeastern Europe could have looked very different. A surviving Byzantium would not have re-established a global empire, but it could have endured as a city-state or small Orthodox kingdom, possibly under the protection of Western Europe, serving as a buffer between Christendom and the rising Ottoman tide. The city's symbolic power, as the seat of Eastern Christianity, would have remained intact. Its church, its institutions, and its legacy might have charted a path closer to Rome, politically, if not theologically. Without Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire would have lacked the logistical and symbolic center that helped drive its expansion into Europe. A capital in Edirne or Bursa would have had strategic value, but not the psychological weight of Rome's eastern twin. Their advance through the Balkans might have slowed, resisted not only by fractured local forces, but by a more coordinated Christian front, galvanized by a shared interest in preserving Byzantium. And today, the city standing on the Bosphorus might still be called Constantinople, Orthodox Greek-speaking with basilicas instead of mosques, spires instead of minarets. Turkish influence in the region would remain strong, but its cultural center might be further inland, its imperial legacy altered. The echoes of Byzantium would not only live in ruins and textbooks, but in cathedrals, street signs, and daily prayers. And the question, is Istanbul Constantinople, would never need to be asked. It always was. If Portugal had fallen to Castile, Portugal today is proudly distinct, a separate language, a separate identity, a separate Atlantic rhythm. From Lisbon's tiled hills to the fado echoing in coastal cafes, it stands apart, not just from Spain, but from much of Europe. Yet in the late 14th century, that independence was anything but secure, and for a moment, it nearly vanished. In 1383, King Fernando I of Portugal died without a male heir, plunging the kingdom into a full-blown succession crisis. His only daughter, Beatrice, was married to King Juan I of Castile, giving the Castilian crown a legal claim to Portugal. For many Portuguese nobles, this was a direct threat, not just a dynastic union, but annexation. Factions formed quickly. The Portuguese court was divided between those who favoured Castilian rule and those who feared it. At the centre of the resistance stood Jean, master of Avis, a royal bastard with no legitimate claim, but strong backing from Lisbon's merchant class and much of the lower nobility. Civil war followed, marked by political assassinations, skirmishes, and foreign intervention. The crisis came to a head at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385. Jean's forces, outnumbered and poorly equipped, faced the full might of Castile's army. But with tactical help from English allies and a well-chosen defensive position, the Portuguese managed a stunning victory. Castile's cavalry was broken. Jean became King Jean I, founding the Avis dynasty. Portuguese independence was secured, and with it, the future of a global maritime empire. But the outcome had been far from certain. Had Castile won that day, had Jean fallen, or the nobility swung the other way, Portugal could have been absorbed into Castile more than a century before Spain formally unified. The implications are vast. A united Iberian kingdom would have emerged by the late 1300s, decades before the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. Portugal, instead of launching its own age of discovery, might have become just another coastal region under Castilian control. The Portuguese language, so close to Spanish linguistically, could have faded into a regional dialect. Its literature, courts, and schools gradually Hispanicized. Lisbon, once a capital of exploration and empire, might have become a provincial port. Names like Vasco da Gama, Bartolomeu Dias, and Prince Henry the Navigator, if remembered at all, might be listed as Spanish heroes in Castilian textbooks. And today, there mightn't be a Portuguese seat at the UN, no Lusophone world, no independent cultural legacy stretching from Brazil to Mozambique. There would only have been one Iberian empire dividing the globe. The Greater Iberia would be Europe's largest country by area, more populous, more powerful, but also more uniform. Fewer border crossings, fewer flags, less fado, more flamenco. The tiles might still be blue, but the passport would be red and yellow. A Nasserless Egypt. Modern Egypt is a republic shaped by revolution. From the fall of the monarchy in 1952 to the rise of Arab nationalism under Gamal Abdel Nasser, it has long been a center of regional politics, pan-Arab identity, and shifting global alliances. But for all the power Egypt has wielded since the mid-20th century, its republican story began with a single knight and a group of junior army officers. In July 1952, a secretive faction known as the Free Officers, led by Mohammed Naguib and the ambitious Gamal Abdel Nasser, staged a coup that forced King Farouk to abdicate. The monarchy collapsed. The British-backed elite lost influence. Land reform, nationalism, and a sweeping wave of Arab socialism followed. Within a few years, Egypt became the face of post-colonial resistance and a key player in the Cold War. But that coup, while successful, wasn't inevitable. Had it been discovered in advance, or crushed quickly by royalist forces, the monarchy might have survived, with British backing and international recognition preserving its status. And today, Egypt would feel different. The flag might still feature a crown. The Arab Republic would remain the Kingdom of Egypt, more ceremonial perhaps, but still symbolically intact. Cairo's skyline might include a royal palace that never became a museum, and the name Farouk might be remembered not as a final chapter, but as one in a longer lineage. The political atmosphere would be more conservative and more elite-driven. the revolutionary land reforms likely would have been postponed or diluted. Arab socialism might never take hold. Egypt could have remained a monarchist, pro-Western state, less tied to the Soviet bloc, more aligned with British and American interests in the Middle East. The Suez Crisis might have played out as a diplomatic showdown rather than a nationalist flashpoint. Without Nasser's leadership, Egypt's role in pan-Arabism would shrink. The broader movement for Arab unity, stretching from Damascus to Algiers, might never have had its unifying figure. The non-aligned movement, too, would feel thinner without Egypt at its core. And economically, a monarchy might have leaned more heavily on commercial elites and foreign capital. State industries may never have been nationalized. Political Islam might have gained traction earlier, filling the vacuum left by the absence of populist revolution. In today's world, Egypt would still be influential, but different in tone and identity. Less revolutionary, more restrained. Still the heart of the Arab world, but beating to a quieter rhythm behind a royal seal. If Biafra survived. Today, Nigeria is Africa's most populous country, but in an alternate timeline, it isn't, because Biafra made it. If the secessionist state had held Port Harcourt in 1968, everything could have changed. Oil revenue would have kept flowing, international support, especially from France or Israel, might have expanded. The Nigerian army, facing stronger resistance and fewer resources, might have been pushed into a ceasefire, a peace deal. 2 countries instead of 1. Biafra could have been a wealthy, oil-rich nation, small in land but big in influence. Its economy, driven by Niger Delta oil, would rival the top economies in Africa. Port Harcourt and Enugu would be booming, globally connected cities, energy hubs with pipelines, high-rises, and foreign embassies. Biafra would likely be a high-stakes balancing act, part democracy, part national myth. The war would define its identity, framed not as a loss avoided but a fight won. Every institution from schools to parliament would trace its roots back to a story of survival. Nigeria would be smaller and a lot less centralized. Losing the southeast would fracture the federation's sense of unity. Calls for independence in the southwest or the Niger Delta might follow. Nigeria might even be 3 or 4 countries today, not 1. West Africa's map would look totally different, more fragmented, more dynamic, and possibly more tense. Border disputes, resource competition, but also trade, competition, and diplomacy between new regional players. In the broader world, Biafra might punch above its weight. A loud voice in the African Union, a close partner to France, maybe even an emerging power in tech or renewable energy, using wealth to diversify early. The Igbo diaspora would serve as economic and political bridges to Europe, North America, and Asia. Biafra would be unapologetically Igbo. Language, literature, music, film, all infused with a national story built on endurance. The Biafran flag wouldn't just fly on Independence Day, it would be on billboards, in classrooms, and on passports. A living symbol, not a relic. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, the national narrative would be different. Without Biafra, the giants of Africa would become more introspective. Federalism might be weaker. Military politics might have lasted longer. The North-South divide would still exist, but with fewer resources and more tension. A nationalist victory in the Chinese Civil War. Today's China is ruled by the Communist Party, led by a centralized state and defined by decades of rapid economic growth under strict political control. But this wasn't inevitable. In the late 1940s, the Chinese Civil War was still up for grabs, and for a while, it looked like the nationalists might actually win. After World War II, the fragile alliance between Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and Mao Zedong's communists collapsed. The country descended into civil war. The nationalists had more troops, better weapons, and significant American support. But poor leadership, widespread corruption, and a failure to win over China's rural majority ultimately handed the victory to Mao. In 1949, the communists took Beijing. Chiang and the KMT fled to Taiwan, and that's where their vision of China stayed. But what if they'd held on? If the nationalists had been better at land reform, cleaned up internal corruption, and used foreign aid more effectively, they might have kept control of mainland China. In that world, China becomes one of the largest anti-communist states in the early Cold War. Instead of the People's Republic, we'd be looking at the Republic of China, with its capital still in Nanjing, not Taipei. The effects would ripple far beyond China. A KMT-controlled mainland likely aligns with the United States, joining the anti-Soviet bloc in Asia. The Korean War might unfold very differently with a powerful US-backed China on the map. Vietnam? Maybe it never becomes a major American conflict at all. The Cold War in Asia would tilt hard against communism. China under the KMT wouldn't be democratic overnight. Chiang's regime was authoritarian and political freedom would have come slowly, if at all. But large-scale campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution would never happen. No tens of millions of deaths from famine, no decade-long ideological purges. Instead, you'd likely see a controlled, state-led modernization gradually loosening over time. This alternate China could have followed a path similar to Taiwan's, export-driven, industrialized, and tightly managed. But scaled up to a population of over 1 billion, it might have become a global economic superpower much earlier. Think booming factories and tech giants, not in the 2000s, but by the 1980s. And today, China might still be a one-party state, but with friendlier ties to the West, fewer sanctions, and a permanent seat at the capitalist table. Less censorship, more integration. The phrase China threat might not show up in as many headlines because this China would have never broken with the world in the first place. A communist Indonesia. Modern Indonesia is the world's third largest democracy, an archipelago of more than 270 million people balancing Islam, pluralism, and the lingering shadows of its authoritarian past. For over 3 decades, it was ruled by General Suharto's New Order regime, stable on paper, repressive in practice. But in the mid-1960s, that future was still unwritten, and for a brief, violent period, Indonesia stood on the edge of a different path. In 1965, a failed coup attempt blamed on the Indonesian Communist Party triggered a political earthquake. President Sukarno, the charismatic founder of the republic and champion of non-aligned ideals, was quickly sidelined. Into the power vacuum stepped General Suharto, head of the Army's Strategic Command. What followed was one of the bloodiest anti-communist purges of the Cold War. Hundreds of thousands killed, and the Indonesian Communist Party all but eradicated. By 1966, Suharto had seized effective control. Sukarno was placed under house arrest. The new order was born, ushering in decades of military-backed governance, press censorship, and staunch alignment with the West. But none of it was inevitable. Had Sukarno retained his grip, whether through loyalist units, a mobilized leftist coalition, or broader international supports, the Indonesian Communist Party might have survived. Indonesia, then the third largest communist party outside China and the USSR, could have played a dramatically different role in the Cold War. Instead of pivoting toward the United States, Indonesia might have leaned left, aligning more closely with China, the Soviet Union, or other non-aligned socialist states. Its domestic policies would likely have emphasized mass mobilization over military control, with a broader space for leftist ideologies, trade unions, and populist economics. The Communist Party could have evolved into a legal and influential political force, not erased from history, but integrated into a pluralistic, socialist-leaning system. The military's role in government would have been diminished, and the technocratic elites of Suharto's era may have never emerged in the same form. Indonesia's development would have taken a different path. State-led planning might have shaped early industrialization. The dominance of Jakarta and Java could have been challenged by more regionally balanced policies. Fewer conglomerates tied to generals, more cooperatives and state-owned enterprises. In regional terms, the effect would have been seismic. A left-leaning Indonesia would have disrupted American Cold War strategy in Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia might have found a powerful ideological ally to the south. The creation and shape of ASEAN would look very different if it existed at all. The events of 1956 wouldn't be national trauma buried in silence. They'd be the subject of open debate. The disappeared would be named in textbooks, not forgotten. Sukarno's legacy wouldn't be nostalgic, it would be constitutional. A different republic, still loud, still pluralist, but shaped by different choices. And Jakarta? Still crowded, still humid, but with a very different story to tell. Republic of Thailand. Modern Thailand balances tradition and change. It's a constitutional monarchy where the crown remains deeply respected, but military coups, mass protests, and constitutional resets have shaped its politics time and time again. For all its modernity, the monarchy continues to serve as a pillar of Thai identity. But in 1932, that foundation nearly disappeared, either quietly or entirely. That year, a coalition of civil servants, military officers, and intellectuals calling themselves the People's Party staged a nearly bloodless coup, ending over 700 years of absolute monarchy. King Rama VII accepted the new order with minimal resistance, and Siam transitioned into a constitutional monarchy. It was a revolution, but a restrained one. The monarchy was preserved in symbolic form, and before long, the military emerged as a dominant force behind the scenes. But the moment was fragile. The coup succeeded largely because it caught the royal establishment off guard. If the palace had acted quickly, or if loyalist military units had intervened, the movement might have collapsed. The absolute monarchy could have endured for decades longer, adapting on its own terms. On the other hand, if the People's Party had moved faster, or if public support had surged, Thailand might have become a full republic, severing ties with the monarchy entirely. Each path leads to a very different present. In one direction, a surviving absolute monarchy might have ruled directly over the mid-20th century, much like pre-war Japan or Iran under the Shah. Modernization could have been guided from above, selective, centralized, and focused on preserving royal authority. The military would still rise in influence, but likely as an extension of the crown. Pro-democracy movements might have emerged later and met harsher suppression when they did. Thailand's global stance, especially during World War II and the Cold War, could have tilted toward conservative monarchies or neutral authoritarian states, rather than leaning west. In the other direction, a Republic of Thailand, the landscape would be politically unrecognizable. Without the monarchy as a cultural and symbolic anchor, national identity might have been shaped more by party politics, populist movements, or military factions. Political life could have been more open, but also more volatile, with less institutional continuity. Public trust would rest in elected officials or secular institutions, not royal tradition. Thailand's regional posture would likely shift too. A republic might present a more pragmatic, less ceremonial foreign policy, more akin to Indonesia's turbulent democracy or South Korea's developmental state model. Tourism would still thrive, but built around civic culture, modern urbanism, and Buddhist heritage rather than royal imagery. Either way, 1932 was more than a transition. It was a fork in the road. The monarchy's survival shaped how Thailand balances modern politics with traditional legitimacy. Whether reformed, restrained, or removed entirely, that turning point still echoes through the streets of Bangkok today. Malaysian-Singapore Union. Today, Malaysia and Singapore stand side by side, two nations with shared roots but very different rhythms. One is a multi-ethnic federation with vast resources and a growing middle class. The other, a lean city-state built on global finance, order, and efficiency. But for a brief window in the 1960s, they were one, and they very nearly stayed that way. In 1963, Singapore joined Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak to form the Federation of Malaysia. The goal was bold but clear: regional consolidation for defense, development, and post-colonial stability. The idea had logic, combining markets, labor, and infrastructure, but the political chemistry was unstable from the start. Tensions over racial policies, economic equity, and political influence quickly emerged. Singapore's People's Action Party clashed with UMNO over questions of equality and electoral competition. Riots flared, trust eroded. In 1965, Singapore was expelled from the Federation, not by war, but by political divorce. But it didn't have to happen that way. With more compromise on power sharing, revenue distribution, or communal sensitivities, the Federation might have held together. And today, a Greater Malaysia, with Singapore still inside, would be a different kind of power in Southeast Asia. Singapore's port, talent pool, and early ambition would still be major assets, but its development might have looked different. Without the existential pressure of independence, Singapore may not have pursued such aggressive industrial policy, global branding, or state-led innovation. Its rise as a world-class financial hub was partly a reaction to being cut off. Inside a larger federation, Singapore's influence would be tempered by federal constraints and national priorities. It might still be efficient, but less autonomous. Urban planning, immigration, and taxation would still be subject to federal politics. Growth would still happen, but spread more evenly across the country. Johor, Penang, and Sabah might gain more from federal infrastructure planning than in our timeline. Kuala Lumpur and Singapore could operate as twin cities, one political, one commercial, but neither dominating. The balance would likely slow down Singapore's rise, but lift surrounding regions. Politically, the fusion would force real negotiation. The People's Action Party's multiracial meritocracy would clash or blend with Malaysia's communal-based politics. That friction could either strain the system or drive democratic reform across the federation. And regionally, with Singapore's global networks embedded in a larger, resource-rich state, Greater Malaysia would carry more weight in ASEAN. Investors wouldn't have to choose between the two. It would be one unified market. In today's world, there mightn't be a border checkpoint at Johor, just a metro line running from Orchard Road to Iskandar. Two flags might still be one, and 1965 would be remembered not just as rupture, but as the moment the Federation bent and didn't break. A closed Japan. Modern Japan is known for its high-tech economy, global cultural exports, and one of the fastest modernization stories in history. But in the mid-1800s, it was still a feudal society ruled by a military government that had kept the outside world at bay for over 200 years. That system nearly held. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan followed sakoku, or closed country policy. Foreign contact was tightly controlled, limited to a few Dutch and Chinese traders in Nagasaki. Western ideas, missionaries, and weapons were largely shut out. The system maintained internal order, but at the cost of technological stagnation. Then, in 1853, everything changed. US Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with steam-powered black ships and a demand: open your ports or else. Faced with superior firepower and diplomatic pressure, the shogunate agreed. Japan opened to the world. The shogun's authority collapsed, and by 1868, the Meiji Restoration was underway, ushering in rapid modernization, centralization, and eventually empire. But what if Perry had failed? If Japan had repelled or delayed Western intrusion through negotiation, military resistance, or simply luck, the Tokugawa system might have held on. In that version of history, Japan remains feudal well into the late 19th or even 20th century. No Meiji-era industrial revolution, no conscript army, no railroads, no factories producing rifles and steel. Samurai remain a formal class. Rice, not railways, defines the economy. Western science and engineering trickle in slowly, if at all. By the time global empires are fully established, Britain in India, France in Indochina, and the US in the Philippines, Japan would be under-equipped and politically fragmented. Instead of becoming a colonial power, Japan might face becoming a colony itself. A divided Japan under Western spheres of influence is possible, much like China during the same period. In a modern world, a Japan that never industrialized on its own timeline would be far less influential. It might resemble Thailand or even pre-modern Korea. Culturally rich, historically proud, but economically dependent and geopolitically secondary. Its population might be smaller, its cities less vertical, its exports more traditional than technological. No anime boom, no bullet trains, no Toyota or Sony or Nintendo. Global pop culture would lose a powerhouse, and without its rise as a military and industrial power, Japan likely plays no major role in the major 20th century conflicts. No invasions of China, no Pearl Harbor, no Pacific War. Instead of being seen as a miracle economy or a former Axis power turned pacifist innovator, Japan might be remembered as the Asian kingdom that stayed closed just a little too long. A British United States. The United States exists today as a global superpower, born in revolution and raised on the idea that it broke free from Britain once and for all. Its institutions, its identity, even its national mythology are rooted in that hard-won independence. But in 1780, that future came dangerously close to unraveling because of one man, one fort, and one intercepted letter. During the American Revolutionary War, General Benedict Arnold was a rising star turned bitter traitor. Disillusioned with the Continental Congress and tempted by British promises of gold and glory, Arnold plotted to surrender the key American stronghold at West Point. Why was West Point so important? It sat at a choke point on the Hudson River, a vital artery connecting New England with the rest of the colonies. Control the Hudson, and you could split the revolution in half. The plan might have worked, if not for a single twist of fate. British Major John Andre, carrying the secret documents, was captured before he could return to British lines. With Andre exposed, the whole scheme collapsed. But if he had slipped through, West Point could have quietly fallen. Would that have ended the war though? Unlikely. By 1780, France was already in the fight and the Continental Army had endured major setbacks before. But losing West Point could have been a major blow. It might have shattered morale, boosted loyalist support, and pushed American leaders toward a British-offered settlement. Instead of full independence in 1783, the war might have dragged on or ended in compromise. Maybe freedom comes years later. Maybe Britain holds on to part of the colonies. Maybe the future superpower takes a different shape. Fast forward to today, and that alternate America might not look so American. Picture a Dominion of America. Still English-speaking, still powerful, but with a parliamentary system, a monarch's face on the currency, and a governor-general instead of a president. The 4th of July doesn't exist. Maybe there's a Union Day. Less rebellion, more ceremony. Its flag, red, white, and blue, but with the Union Jack in its corner. Its culture would be more BBC and less reality TV. Probably cricket instead of baseball. Would it still be a global heavyweight? Absolutely, but a quieter one. Less about manifest destiny, more about Commonwealth diplomacy. A strange outcome, sure, but not impossible. All it would have taken was one traitor, one fort, and one British spy who didn't get caught. An Argentinian victory in the Falklands. Today, Argentina is a democracy with regular elections, a vocal press, and a long memory of military rule. That memory begins to fade in the 1980s after a brutal dictatorship and an economic collapse gave way to civilian leadership. But the real turning point came in 1982 on windswept islands thousands of miles from Buenos Aires. The Falklands War was short but consequential. Argentina's ruling military junta, facing domestic unrest and economic crisis, launched an invasion of the British-controlled Falkland Islands, hoping to rally nationalist sentiment and distract from repression at home. Britain, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, responded swiftly. Over 10 weeks, the war escalated into a full-scale naval and ground campaign. Argentina lost. The defeat shattered the junta's credibility, and within a year the generals were out and democracy returned. But the war was closer than it looked. A few more British ships sunk, a better defense of Port Stanley, a diplomatic delay, or a colder US response. The outcome could have shifted, and with it, Argentina's entire political future. Had Argentina won, or simply avoided a clear defeat, the military regime might have remained in power for years longer. Victory in the South Atlantic would have been mythologized as a triumph over colonialism, rewriting the regime's image from brutal enforcers to patriotic liberators. And today, Argentina might still even be ruled by a military government, one that survived by weaponizing national pride and suppressing dissent under the banner of sovereignty. The democratic opening of the late 1980s could have been delayed by decades. The dirty war, in which thousands were disappeared, might never have formally been acknowledged. Human rights groups would remain underground. Truth commissions, unthinkable. The economy, already battered in the early 80s, might have limped along under state control, with nationalist messaging papering over stagnation. Foreign debt would mount. Exile, not reform, would define the experience of many Argentines. A victorious junta could have further curtailed freedoms in the name of preserving national unity. Internationally, the regime might have gained symbolic status in parts of the global south, as a country that stood up to a major Western power and won. But it would be increasingly isolated, alienated from liberal democracies, sanctioned by human rights advocates, and distrusted by investors. Meanwhile, South America's political dynamics would shift. Neighboring democracies like Brazil or Chile post-Pinochet would find themselves recalibrating their stance toward a military-ruled Argentina, projecting strength from a position of post-war pride. And in Britain, a failed Falklands campaign might have toppled Margaret Thatcher's government, changing the course of British politics and weakening Britain's influence in NATO and the European project. In the present day, Argentina would still claim the Falklands, but from a position of control, not aspiration. Its capital would echo with martial pride, not democratic reckoning. The memory of war would be national glory and not a national wound. And the junta's legacy, etched in granite, not judged in court. A Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that endured. Modern Poland stands as a proud European democracy, rooted in NATO and the EU, fiercely independent and shaped by a long history of resistance, revival, and rebirth. But for over a century, there was no Poland at all. Between 1772 and 1795, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was carved apart by its neighbours until it vanished from the map entirely. What followed was occupation, uprising, and a national identity built in exile. But it wasn't inevitable. At its height, the Commonwealth was one of Europe's largest states, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, uniting Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians in a sprawling, if fragile, federation. But internal dysfunction, a weak central monarchy, and the liberum veto, which let any noble halt legislation, left it vulnerable. By the time meaningful reform arrived in the form of the Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791, it was already too late. The surrounding empires moved in. The borders were erased. But what if those reforms had held? If Russia had been occupied elsewhere or Austria and Prussia less coordinated, the Commonwealth might have survived, reformed, modernized, and still sovereign. And today, that Commonwealth might still exist in some form, a constitutional monarchy or federal republic at the heart of Eastern Europe. Its capital in Warsaw, its parliaments in Vilnius, Lviv, and Minsk. A multi-ethnic, multi-confessional state navigating modernization not by being broken apart, but by staying together. The impact on European history would be profound. Napoleon's campaigns, the 19th century revolutions, even World War I would unfold on a very different stage. A strong Polish-Lithuanian presence might have checked Russian expansion westward. The Baltic states might have remained integrated with a federal structure. Ukrainian and Belarusian nationalism would evolve under different cultural pressures, not from Moscow, but from Warsaw and Vilnius. In the 20th century, there might be no reborn Poland because there'd be no need for rebirth. No partitions, no uprisings crushed in Krakow or Vilnius, no century-long absence. The scars of World War II would still run deep, but the framework of statehood might have endured, giving this region a political continuity most of Eastern Europe never had. And today's map, it wouldn't just show Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus as separate nations, it might mark the borders of a larger, older idea, reimagined for a modern age. A Commonwealth that never disappeared, still negotiating unity in diversity, still standing between East and West, not as a battleground, but as a bridge. A Russia-aligned Ukraine in the 2010s. Today's Ukraine is a nation at war, fighting not just for territory, but for its identity, sovereignty, and direction. Since 2014, it has stood on the front line between Western integration and Russian pressure, its people enduring invasion, occupation, and a grinding, high-stakes struggle for national survival. But none of that was inevitable. The story could have taken another path, beginning not on the battlefield, but in a moment of hesitation. In late 2013, Ukraine's then president, Viktor Yanukovych, faced a defining choice. Move forward with a long-anticipated association agreement with the European Union, or reject it in favor of closer alignment with Moscow. After years of negotiation, the EU deal was expected, but under pressure from Russia, Yanukovych backed away. That decision sparked protests in Kiev's Independence Square, initially peaceful and then widespread. Euromaidan began as a pro-European demonstration. It escalated into a revolution. By February 2014, Yanukovych had fled the country. Russia annexed Crimea weeks later. Armed conflict erupted in the Donbass. The post-Soviet map cracked open. But what if none of that had happened? If Yanukovych had signed the EU agreement, perhaps after last-minute concessions, or if he had successfully suppressed protests early on, Ukraine might have avoided the tipping point. The crisis of 2014 might have been diffused rather than detonated. And today, Ukraine might still be officially whole. Crimea would remain under Ukrainian administration. Russian troops might never have crossed the border. The Donbass would still be known for coal, not trenches. There would be no daily war reports, no destroyed cities, no refugee columns stretching into Poland and Moldova. The global economy might have been spared the energy shocks and food supply disruptions that followed full-scale invasion. But peace would come with a cost. A Yanukovych-led Ukraine, having distanced itself from Europe, would likely lean heavily on Russian financial support. The country's institutions, already fragile, might have grown more dependent on oligarchs and Kremlin-linked interests. Reforms driven by Euromaidan, like anti-corruption initiatives, media independence, and judicial modernization, would likely stall or never begin. Civil society would remain weaker. Freedom of expression, already under pressure before 2014, might face increasing state control. The democratic energy that has since defined Ukrainian resilience might have faded in a more controlled, quieter political space. Foreign policy would follow suit. NATO and EU integration would be postponed, if not permanently shelved. Ukraine would be seen less as a rising European partner and more as a geopolitical buffer, a space between blocs rather than a state with its own trajectory. From afar, it might look like stability, but under the surface, tensions would simmer between East and West, reform and repression, and sovereignty and influence. Ukraine might be peaceful, but that peace would come at a cost. Islamic Spain. Today's Spain is seen as a unified Catholic nation shaped by conquest, centralization, and empire. But in 1492, that version of Spain wasn't guaranteed. The final chapter of the Reconquista ended with the fall of Granada, the last Islamic stronghold in Iberia. It marked the end of Al-Andalus and the beginning of a very different Spain. But the outcome wasn't inevitable. For more than 700 years, Islamic rule had shaped parts of the Iberian Peninsula. Cities like Cordoba, Toledo, and Granada had been home to Muslims, Christians, and Jews, often uneasily, but side by side nonetheless. By the late 15th century, only Granada remained under Muslim control. It was isolated, surrounded, and under siege. Had Granada received military and financial support from North Africa, perhaps from the Wattasids of Morocco, or even a last-minute intervention by the Ottoman Navy, the siege might have been broken. The balance of power would have shifted, and the Christian monarchs may have been forced to negotiate rather than conquer. Granada could have survived, still independent and still Islamic. Without the decisive victory in 1492, Spain's unification is incomplete. The Alhambra decree, which expelled Spain's Jews, may never be issued. Forced conversions of Muslims might not follow. Instead of a clean sweep, the Iberian Peninsula remains contested religiously and politically for decades, perhaps centuries. Spain's global rise slows. Without a quick victory, funds and focus stay local. The age of exploration is delayed. Columbus's voyage might never even leave port, or may fly another flag. Spain's colonial empire builds more slowly or takes a different form entirely. Modern Spain would likely be a pluralistic state, not just historically but institutionally. A nation shaped by multiple faiths, legal traditions, and languages. The legacy of Al-Andalus would still be living, not archived, woven into law, education, and national identity. Cities like Granada and Seville wouldn't just preserve Moorish architecture, they'd operate in both Catholic and Islamic civic traditions. Public holidays, court systems, and even school curricula might reflect a dual religious and cultural heritage. Spain could resemble a Mediterranean version of Lebanon or Bosnia, a democratic system designed to manage religious power sharing. Contentious at times, but representative. Islam would be a mainstream presence, not immigrant but indigenous, not tolerated but recognized. Saudi Arabia with no oil wealth. Today, Saudi Arabia is a pillar of global energy markets, a kingdom defined by oil wealth, towering skylines, and geopolitical clout. But that identity was shaped almost entirely in the 20th century. Before oil, Saudi Arabia was poor, rural, and politically fragile, held together by religious legitimacy and tribal alliances, not financial power. In the 1930s, American companies began surveying the eastern deserts of the kingdom, hoping to replicate discoveries made elsewhere in the region. For years, they drilled without success. The work was expensive, the climate brutal, and the geology uncertain. In many scenarios, the venture could have failed due to technical limits, lack of funding, or shifting political winds. Had that happened, Saudi Arabia would have remained a very different country. Without the revenues that poured in after oil was struck in 1938, the kingdom would have struggled to modernize. Development would have been slower, patchier, and dependent on pilgrimage traffic and modest regional trade. Riyadh, far from being a polished administrative capital, might have remained a dusty tribal town. Jeddah and Mecca would likely contribute to serve as religious and cultural hubs, but without the infrastructure that came with state-sponsored expansion. The Al Saud family would have had a harder time consolidating control. Without oil to distribute patronage or fund a sprawling state, local power structures, tribes, clerics, and regional elites would carry more influence. Political legitimacy would rely more heavily on consensus and faith than cash. Opposition might not come from abroad, but from within. Social services, education, and healthcare would evolve gradually, if at all. Large-scale modernization, universities, roads, telecommunications, might arrive decades late or not at all. Economic opportunity would probably be limited to traditional sectors: small-scale agriculture, pilgrimage services, and trade through Red Sea ports. Beyond the kingdom, the impact would ripple across the Gulf. Other oil-rich states, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, perhaps even the UAE, would emerge as dominant forces in the region. OPEC might exist, but with Saudi Arabia playing a far smaller role. The global economy, less dependent on Saudi oil, might have developed alternative supply routes and strategic alliances. In the present day, a Saudi Arabia without oil would be quieter, less visible on the global stage, its military smaller, its diplomacy less assertive, its ambitions scaled down. There would be no mega projects in the desert, no sovereign wealth funds reshaping global tech and finance, no Vision 2030. Just a kingdom defined more by its past than its projections for the future. Still sacred, still strategic, but with far less power and far fewer headlines.